The cowboy almost shut the door on the woman in rags, until his little boy grabbed her hand and said something that made him freeze. Snow blasted through the open doorway as the woman swayed on the porch, clutching a nearly empty carpet bag. Melted ice dripped from the hem of her torn coat onto Silas Bennett's floorboards, while the wind howled across Red Hollow Ranch. Then his son stepped between them, wrapped both small hands around hers, and whispered, "Please don't send her back into the storm, Papa." But the look on the stranger's face made Silas realize something far worse might already be chasing her. "Stay with us tonight and tell me where you're watching from." The wind hit the side of the cabin hard enough to rattle the tin wash basin hanging beside the door. Snow swept across Red Hollow Ranch in white sheets, swallowing the fence posts one by one, until the world beyond the barn looked like nothing at all. Somewhere out in the dark, a loose shutter banged against wood in steady rhythm. The horses in the stable shifted nervously, their breath steaming through the cracks. Silas Bennett stood at the front window with one hand braced against the frame. Frost had crept over the corners of the glass hours ago. Beyond it lay the narrow road from Cedar Creek, nearly buried now beneath the storm. The stagecoach should have arrived before sundown. It was long past dark. Behind him, 6-year-old Owen sat cross-legged on the braided rug near the fireplace, carefully tying twine around 3 crooked pine branches he'd dragged in from outside earlier that morning. "It looks more like a broom than a Christmas tree," Owen said seriously. Silas grunted faintly. The boy glanced up. "Do you think she changed her mind?" Silas kept his eyes on the storm. "Wouldn't blame her if she did." Owen frowned at that. "Mrs. Parker says mail-order brides are brave. Mrs. Parker says a lot of things." The child went quiet again, though Silas could feel the disappointment settling over the room like another layer of snow. 3 months ago, he'd answered an advertisement in a newspaper out of St. Louis. Widower rancher seeking respectable woman for marriage and home. No romance promised, frontier life. 1 child. He'd stared at the wording for nearly an hour before mailing it. Not because he wanted a wife. Because Owen needed more than cold suppers and silence. Because winter nights inside this cabin had started to feel like standing inside a grave. The door suddenly shook beneath a heavy knock. Owen sprang up so fast he nearly knocked over the chair beside him. "She's here," Silas's stomach tightened. Another knock came, softer this time. He crossed the room slowly, boots creaking against old floorboards. His hand paused on the latch for 1 long second before he pulled the door open. The storm pushed in first, then the woman. She stood on the porch beneath the swinging lantern light, snow clinging to the shoulders of a thin brown coat torn near the sleeve seam. A faded scarf covered part of her hair, damp with melted ice. 1 shoe had been wrapped with cloth where the leather had split open. In her hand sat a small carpet bag no larger than a loaf of bread. She looked exhausted enough to fall where she stood, but her chin stayed level. "Mr. Bennett," she asked softly. "I'm Clara Whitaker." Silas stared. This was not what he'd imagined. No polished boots, no neat traveling dress, no sturdy frontier woman ready for ranch life. She looked half frozen and 1 strong wind away from breaking apart. For a brief, ugly moment, regret hit him square in the chest. Dear God, what had he done? Behind him, Owen slipped around his legs and stopped dead at the doorway, eyes wide. The boy looked up at Clara, as if she'd stepped out of one of the Christmas stories his mother used to read beside the fire. Snowflakes melted against Clara's eyelashes. Silas noticed her hands then, red from cold, raw around the knuckles but steady. No begging in them, no shame either. The driver atop the stagecoach pulled his coat tighter and called over the wind. "Rodel close by morning, Bennett." Then the coach rolled away into the white darkness, leaving her there, completely alone. Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "If this is inconvenient, I can find a boarding room in town once the storm eases." Silas almost laughed at the idea. Cedar Creek's boarding house barely had room for traveling miners, and not one decent place would take in a woman with no money during a blizzard. Still, every instinct in him said this arrangement had been a mistake. He opened his mouth. Then Owen suddenly grabbed Clara's hand with both of his small mittened ones. "She's freezing, Papa." The words cracked through the cold harder than the wind did. Clara looked startled. So did Silas. The boy tugged her toward the warmth inside without waiting for permission. "Come on. The fire's real warm tonight." Silas stepped aside at last. Clara crossed the threshold carefully, almost like she was afraid to touch anything. Warm air hit her face. For the first time, her composure flickered. Just for a second, her eyes closed briefly as if the heat itself hurt. Owen pulled her toward the fireplace. "You can sit in Mama's chair. It's the warmest spot." Silas stiffened at that, but Clara didn't sit immediately. Instead, she turned toward him first. "Thank you for letting me inside, Mr. Bennett." Simple words, quiet words, still carrying dignity somehow, despite the snow melting from her torn sleeves onto his floorboards. Silas took her carpet bag from her hand before he could think better of it. It weighed almost nothing. That bothered him more than it should have. He pointed toward the chair beside the fire. "Sit before you fall over." Owen hurried toward the stove. "I'll get coffee." "You'll spill it." "I won't." "You absolutely will." The boy grinned for the first time all evening. Clara eased herself into the chair slowly, hands stretched toward the flames. Firelight softened the sharp exhaustion in her face. She couldn't have been older than 24. Too young for this kind of hardship, too tired for her age. Silas hung her coat near the stove to dry, and noticed several careful stitches along the inside lining where the fabric had been repaired by hand. Precise work, done more than once. Owen returned carrying a chipped coffee cup with both hands. Hot liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim. "Easy," Silas warned. The boy delivered it proudly to Clara anyway. She accepted it carefully. "Thank you. That was Mama's favorite cup," Owen explained. "Papa says it leaks a little, but I think it just whistles." Silas rubbed a hand across his jaw. Clara glanced down at the cracked handle before wrapping both hands around it gently. "Then I'll be extra careful with it." The room went quiet except for the wind outside and the hiss of burning pine in the fireplace. Silas studied her over the rim of his own cup. She drank slowly, like someone making warmth last. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that bothered him too. Because this woman had arrived carrying almost nothing. And yet somehow she didn't look small. She looked tired, cold, alone, but not broken. That made him uneasy in ways he didn't understand. The storm grew worse after supper. Snow piled halfway up the porch rails. Silas checked the barn twice before finally bolting the cabin door for the night. He showed Clara the spare room near the back hallway. It held little more than a narrow bed, a wash basin, and an old quilt folded at the foot. "It ain't much," he said. "It's more than enough." She said it honestly. That bothered him too. Later, long after the lamps were turned low, Silas sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into cold coffee while the wind screamed across the valley. Tomorrow morning, he'd hitch the wagon, take her back to Cedar Creek, find some arrangement. Something simpler, safer, for all of them. The house had already survived one death. He wasn't foolish enough to invite another kind of heartbreak inside it. Then suddenly, laughter, small, bright, real. Silas looked up sharply. It came from down the hallway. Owen, laughing. Not polite chuckling. Not the forced little smiles he'd learned to wear after his mother died. Real laughter. Silas hadn't heard that sound in months. Maybe longer. Another softer voice answered him. Clara's. Then Owen laughed again. Silas sat perfectly still while the storm battered the cabin walls around him. And for the first time since the stagecoach disappeared into the snow, uncertainty settled into his chest beside the regret. Because already, something inside this house had begun to change. Silas noticed it the next morning before sunrise. Usually, the cabin greeted him with cold silence and yesterday's ashes sitting dead in the stove. But when he stepped from his room, pulling on his work coat, he caught the smell of coffee drifting through the dark. Not burnt coffee, fresh coffee. He stopped in the hallway. Soft light flickered beneath the kitchen doorway. Clara stood near the stove with her sleeves rolled carefully past her wrists. Snowlight from the frosted windows touched the side of her face while she stirred something slowly inside an iron pot. She looked up immediately when she heard his boots. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "I found coffee grounds in the blue tin." Silas glanced toward the shelf automatically. Sarah used to keep coffee in the blue tin. Something tightened briefly in his chest. "It's fine," he muttered. Owen burst into the room a second later, wearing one sock and yesterday's shirt half-buttoned wrong. "It smells good." Clara smiled at him before quickly lowering her eyes again, almost like she wasn't sure she had the right to smile too freely in someone else's home. The storm still howled outside. Snow pressed high against the porch rails now. The road to Cedar Creek had vanished completely beneath drifts. Nobody was going anywhere. Silas ate quietly while Owen talked enough for 3 people. "Miss Clara says people in Kansas put cinnamon in oatmeal sometimes." "That sounds terrible," Silas said. "It ain't terrible," Owen argued through a mouthful. "It tastes like Christmas." Clara hid a small smile behind her coffee cup. Silas noticed that too. After breakfast, he headed to the barn. The cold slapped hard against his face the second he stepped outside. Snow squealed beneath his boots. One of the gate hinges had frozen stiff during the night. He spent most of the morning hauling feed, breaking ice in water troughs, and checking the south fence line where the wind hit hardest. By noon, his gloves were stiff with frost. When he finally returned to the cabin, heat rolled toward him the moment he opened the door. And for the first time in years, the place smelled like food instead of survival. Something rich simmered on the stove. Beef stew. Real stew. Not beans thrown into water because a tired man lacked energy for more. Owen sat at the table peeling potatoes badly while Clara stitched the ripped elbow of his winter coat between turns at the stove. The boy looked up proudly. "She says I peel potatoes like a blind raccoon." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "I did not say blind. Just raccoon? Perhaps a small raccoon." Owen laughed hard enough to nearly fall sideways off the chair. Silas stood there longer than necessary, watching. Clara threaded the needle carefully through rough fabric. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, despite the small cracks along her knuckles from cold weather. Every few moments, she paused to warm her fingertips near the stove before continuing. "You don't have to mend that," Silas said finally. She glanced up. "I know." That answer settled strangely in him. No complaint, no performance, just truth. That afternoon, the old mare in the side stable began favoring her front leg again. Silas cursed softly while checking the swollen joint. "She stepped wrong before the storm," he muttered. Clara crouched carefully beside the horse without fear. The mare snorted warm air against her shoulder. "You mind if I look?" Silas hesitated, then nodded once. Clara ran gentle fingers along the leg, pressing lightly around the tendon. The horse calmed beneath her touch instead of fighting it. "She needs rest more than work," Clara said quietly, "and warmth if possible. You know horses? My father traveled between towns treating ranch hands sometimes." She reached for a rag from the nearby shelf. "Mostly injuries. Animals too, when people were desperate enough." Silas watched her wrap the leg neatly with surprising confidence. Again, that uneasy feeling returned. This woman did not match the picture he'd created in his mind. Not weak, not helpless, just worn thin by life. That evening, the wind finally softened. Snow drifted quietly beyond the windows while lamplight warmed the cabin walls gold. Owen sat cross-legged near Clara with a primer book open in his lap. "That word's winter," she told him patiently. The boy squinted hard. "Looks like window." You only think that because both begin with W. Silas pretended to repair harness leather at the far table while listening. He hadn't heard Owen focus this long on anything since Sarah died. Later, after supper dishes were cleaned and the lamps turned low, Silas passed the hallway toward his room and stopped cold. Something rested beside the fireplace. Sarah's old wool scarf, the one stored untouched inside a cedar chest for nearly 3 years. A tear near the fringe had been repaired, so carefully he almost couldn't find the stitching. Silas stared at it for a long moment, then slowly looked toward Clara. She stood near the kitchen counter folding dish towels. "I found it beneath extra blankets," she said softly before he could ask. "I hope I didn't overstep." Silas rubbed a rough hand across his jaw. "No," he said after a moment. "You didn't." Clara nodded once. No questions followed. No mention of Sarah. No careful sympathy people usually offered him in town. Only understanding. Quiet understanding. That somehow felt harder to bear. The house settled around them with soft nighttime creaks. Firelight moved across the walls. Owen had already fallen asleep, curled sideways on the rug, with his book still open beneath one hand. Clara stepped carefully around him and bent to lift the child. Silas moved automatically. "I got him." But Owen stirred halfway awake and reached for Clara's sleeve without opening his eyes. "Stay," he mumbled sleepily. Clara froze. Silas saw the hesitation pass across her face. Not discomfort, sadness, like hearing something she wanted too badly to trust. "It's all right," Silas said quietly. Together they carried the boy down the hallway beneath dim lamplight. Owen's head rested against Clara's shoulder while Snow whispered softly against the cabin roof overhead. And somewhere deep inside himself, Silas Bennett began realizing something dangerous. The cabin no longer felt empty. Not completely. Not anymore. The thought followed Silas Bennett clear into the new year. The storm finally broke 3 days after Christmas. Sunlight returned sharp and white across the Montana hills, glinting off snowdrifts piled shoulder-high along the fence lines. Smoke rose steady from the cabin chimney, while the world slowly thawed enough to breathe again. Clara remained careful inside the house, almost too careful. She moved like someone afraid of taking up space that didn't belong to her. Folding blankets, sweeping snow water from the floorboards near the door. Mending Owen's clothes beside the fire after supper while the boy leaned sleepily against her shoulder. Sometimes Silas caught himself watching them longer than he meant to. That unsettled him more than anything else. One cold morning before dawn, he found Clara outside breaking ice from the chicken trough with the back of a hatchet. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said. She startled out slightly. "The hens needed water. You'll split your hands open in this weather." She lowered the hatchet immediately. "I'm sorry," Silas frowned. Every apology from her sounded automatic, like something worn into her long before she ever reached Red Hollow Ranch. He took the tool gently from her hand. Their fingers brushed for half a second through the cold. Clara pulled back first, not dramatic, just careful. That stayed with him all morning. By the second week of January, the road to Cedar Creek opened enough for wagons again. Silas needed feed, lamp oil, and medicine for the old mare's leg. Owen begged to go. Clara quietly offered to stay behind. "You don't have to hide in this house," Silas said before he could stop himself. A faint shadow crossed her face. "I wasn't hiding," but she still stayed behind. The ride into Cedar Creek took nearly 2 hours through packed snow and frozen ruts. Windmills creaked slowly beyond distant fields. Smoke curled from chimneys above the town like thin gray ribbons. Silas tied the wagon outside Harper's Feed and Supply. The moment he stepped inside, conversation shifted. Not stopped, shifted. Men near the stove glanced up over coffee cups. A pair of ranch wives, beside the flour sacks, lowered their voices. Silas ignored it at first. He ordered oats, salt blocks, lamp oil, and nails for the west fence. Harper wrote the total carefully onto a small paper receipt while rubbing warmth back into his fingers. Then Mildred Hayes appeared beside the counter in a fur-trimmed coat the color of dark wine. "Well," she said smoothly, "if it isn't Silas Bennett." Silas nodded once. "Morning." Her smile sharpened slightly. "We heard your mail-order bride finally arrived." He said nothing. Mildred tilted her head. "Poor thing came in looking half-starved from what folks say." A couple men near the stove pretended not to listen. "She's settling all right," Silas answered flatly. "Is she?" Mildred asked. "Women who arrive alone in winter usually run from something ugly." Silas's jaw tightened. Another woman spoke up quietly near the fabric counter. "I heard she came from Kansas." Mildred hummed. "That's what I heard too. Worked for some doctor there before things turned unpleasant." Silas looked at her sharply. "What things?" Mildred gave a delicate shrug. "Oh, surely you know by now. Missing medicine money. Questions about theft. A woman doesn't flee halfway across the country in rags unless she's escaping something." The store suddenly felt too warm. Silas grabbed the folded receipt harder than necessary. "People say plenty in this town." "They do," Mildred agreed softly. "And they'll say more once they realize you brought that woman into your home with a child under your roof." Something cold slid into Silas's chest then. Not belief, not fully, but doubt. Ugly and quiet. The ride home felt longer. Snow cracked beneath the wagon wheels while Mildred's words circled endlessly through his head. What if he'd been careless? What if loneliness had made him foolish? By the time Red Hollow Ranch appeared through the fading afternoon light, his shoulders ached from tension. Clara stepped onto the porch as he pulled the wagon in. She'd wrapped herself in Sarah's old gray shawl against the cold. Owen stood beside her, waving both mittened hands wildly. "You're late," the boy shouted. Silas climbed down stiffly. Clara noticed it immediately. He saw that in her eyes. "You found everything you needed?" she asked quietly. "Mostly. No warmth in it. No softness. Just distance." He hated hearing it, even as he caused it. That evening supper passed in uneasy silence. Owen tried filling it with chatter about trapping rabbits near the creek once winter ended, but the tension kept creeping back in between sentences like cold air through cracked boards. Clara barely touched her food. Silas stayed outside longer after dark, pretending to repair harness straps in the barn, though his fingers had gone numb an hour earlier. When he finally returned to the cabin, the lamps were nearly out. Owen's bedroom door sat partly open down the hallway. Silas paused when he heard his son's voice. Small, worried. "Miss Clara?" A soft rustle followed. "What is it, sweetheart?" "If you leave too." Owen swallowed hard. "Will it be my fault?" Silas closed his eyes. Inside the room came silence, so deep he could hear the stove ticking in the kitchen. Then Clara answered softly enough he almost missed it. "Oh, Owen." Nothing else at first, just the sound of bed covers shifting. Finally, she said, "None of this has ever been your fault, but people always leave." Silas gripped the hallway wall hard enough for splinters to press into his palm. Clara's voice sounded strained now. "Some do. Are you gonna?" Another silence, longer this time, painfully long. Silas already knew the answer before she spoke. "When the roads clear more," Clara whispered carefully, "it may be best." Something inside him dropped heavily through the quiet. He heard Owen sniff once beneath the blankets. Then Clara began humming softly. The same Kansas lullaby from nights before. Silas stood alone in the dark hallway while shame crept slowly through him. Because for the first time since Sarah died, the house was beginning to feel alive again, and he had started freezing it himself. Much later that night, wind rose once more across the valley. Silas stepped quietly into the kitchen for coffee and stopped cold. Near the front door sat Clara's small carpet bag, packed, ready. A fresh gust of snow rattled the windows hard enough to shake the lantern flame. Then somewhere upstairs, Owen coughed, once, twice, and then again, deep enough to turn Clara's head sharply from the hallway shadows. Another cough tore through the upstairs room. Wet, painful, wrong. Silas moved first, boots striking hard against the floorboards as he crossed the hallway. Clara followed close behind, one hand still gripping the strap of her packed carpet bag before finally letting it slip from her fingers onto the floor. Owen lay tangled in blankets, cheeks flushed dark beneath the lantern glow. His breathing came too fast. Sweat dampened the hair at his temples despite the freezing air leaking through the cabin walls. Silas touched the boy's forehead. His hand jerked back slightly. God, the word barely left his mouth. He knew this heat. 3 winters ago, Sarah's skin had burned exactly the same way. Outside, wind slammed against the cabin hard enough to shake snow from the roof. Clara was already moving. "More wood in the stove," she said calmly. "And boil water, as much as you can." Silas stared at her. Not because she sounded frightened, because she didn't. She pulled folded quilts from the cedar seat chest, wrapped heated bricks from beside the stove in old towels, and knelt beside Owen with steady hands, while the child tossed weakly against the mattress. The storm worsened near midnight. Snow clawed across the windows in thick white waves. The lantern flame flickered low every few minutes whenever wind found cracks between the logs. Silas carried bucket after bucket from melted snow water while Clara cooled Owen's fever with damp cloths. Hours passed that way, no clock, only firelight, boiling water, the scrape of chair legs, and Owen's breathing. At some point, Silas realized Clara had not sat down once. Her sleeves were soaked near the wrists. Loose strands of hair had escaped her braid and clung damply against her face. Still, she kept moving quietly around the room like exhaustion belonged to someone else. Near 2 in the morning, Owen began shaking badly. Panic hit Silas so fast it made him dizzy. "He's getting worse." Clara pressed another cool cloth against the boy's neck. "No, the fever's trying to break. You don't know that." The sharpness in his voice filled the room instantly. Clara looked up. Not angry, just tired. "I do know." Silas turned away hard enough to rattle the wash basin near the wall. He braced both hands against the window frame, staring into the blizzard outside. Sarah had burned with fever for 2 days before dying in this same cabin. Same walls, same winter wind, same helplessness. Behind him, Clara's voice softened almost to a whisper. "Mr. Bennett." He didn't answer. Then more gently, "Silas." The sound of his name in her voice stopped him cold. "He needs calm around him," she said. "Children feel fear even asleep." Silas swallowed hard, then nodded once without turning. Near dawn, Owen finally stirred weakly beneath the blankets. "Mama." The word barely existed, just breath and heartbreak together. Silas closed his eyes. Clara leaned closer immediately, brushing damp curls from the boy's forehead. "I'm right here, sweetheart." No hesitation, no correction, only warmth. Owen's small fingers curled weakly around her sleeve, and Silas felt something inside his chest crack wide open. Because she loved the boy already. Not out of obligation. Not because she needed shelter. Simply because her heart had chosen to. A sudden pounding exploded against the front door downstairs. Silas grabbed the lantern and hurried down while wind screamed through the chimney. When he opened the door, Sheriff Warren Cole nearly stumbled inside beneath a layer of snow and ice. His horse breathed hard outside the porch rail. "Hell of a night," Warren muttered, pulling off soaked gloves. Then his expression shifted. "How's the boy?" "Fever." Warren nodded grimly. Figured as much. His eyes moved toward the staircase where Clara stood half hidden in dim light. "I came because of her too." Silas frowned. Warren reached inside his coat and removed folded papers wrapped carefully in oilcloth. "Took me near a month to track it proper," he said. "Dr. Franklin over in Wichita finally talked after the pharmacy owner got arrested yesterday." Clara went completely still. Warren looked directly at Silas. She never stole a dime. The room fell silent except for wind battering the walls. The pharmacist was skimming money and selling medicine twice over to mining camps, Warren continued. Clara found the fake ledger entries. When she threatened to report him, He pinned the missing cash on her instead. Silas stared. Warren's jaw tightened. Town believed him because she was alone and he wasn't. Clara lowered her eyes quietly. No defense, no anger. Like she'd already spent every ounce of strength surviving the accusation once. She could've kept quiet, Warren said. Would saved herself plenty. Didn't do it anyway. Silas looked toward Clara slowly. At the woman who arrived in torn clothes carrying almost nothing. At the woman who had stayed through the night saving his son while planning to leave before dawn. At the woman he had doubted because frightened people in town found it easier to believe gossip than character. Shame settled deep and heavy in his chest. Warren rested a hand briefly on Silas's shoulder before heading back toward the storm. Road south may clear in 2 days if the wind eases. The door shut behind him. Silence returned. Upstairs, Owen coughed weakly again. Clara turned immediately toward the staircase. But before she could move, Silas spoke. Clara, she stopped. Lantern light flickered softly between them. I'm sorry. The words sounded rough, unpracticed. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded once. No speech, no demand. That somehow made it harder. Near sunrise, Owen's fever finally broke. The child slept deeply at last beneath clean blankets, while pale winter light crept through frosted windows. Clara sat beside the bed, exhaustion finally catching her shoulders now that danger had passed. Silas stood quietly in the doorway, watching her. After a long silence, Clara spoke without looking up. When the road's clear, her fingers smoothed gently through Owen's hair. I'll leave quietly. The words landed softer than snow, but somehow hurt worse. Silas looked around the room then, at the boy sleeping peacefully for the first time in hours, at Clara sitting there worn thin with exhaustion, at the cabin no longer hollow with silence. And suddenly the thought of her leaving felt colder than the storm still raging outside Red Hollow Ranch. The snow finally stopped 2 days later. Not all at once. Just slowly, the wind eased first. Then sunlight returned in pale ribbons across the mountains. Icicles began dripping from the porch roof, one steady drop at a time. Inside the cabin, Owen slept late for the first morning in nearly a week. The fever had left him weak, but smiling again. Clara sat near the window, darning one of his socks while morning light touched the loose strands of hair near her cheek. Her carpet bag remained beside the front door, exactly where she'd left it. Packed. Ready. Silas noticed it every time he crossed the room, and every time something in him tightened. He spent most of that morning repairing a broken stall latch in the barn. Hammer strikes echoed through the cold air, while the horses shifted softly nearby. But his thoughts stayed inside the house, with her. When he returned near noon, he found Clara outside hanging blankets across the line beside the porch. Steam rose faintly from the wet fabric in the freezing air. You should be resting, he said. She glanced toward him. So should you. That almost sounded like teasing, almost. Silas stepped closer to help pin the last blanket. Their hands brushed against the same clothespin at the same moment. Both pulled back slightly. Then neither moved for half a breath. Clara lowered her eyes first. Silas cleared his throat roughly and stepped away toward the woodpile. Coward. The word followed him the rest of the afternoon. Sunday morning arrived clear and painfully bright after weeks of storms. Church bells carried faintly across Cedar Creek as Silas guided the wagon into town. Owen sat bundled between them beneath thick quilts, talking excitedly about seeing Reverend Pike's hunting dog again. Clara stayed quiet beside him. She wore the same dark blue dress from Christmas Eve, carefully mended now, freshly pressed as best she could manage. Sarah's gray shawl rested around her shoulders against the cold. Several heads turned the moment they entered the church hall. Conversation softened, then stopped. Silas felt Clara straighten slightly beside him, not defensive, dignified, like someone preparing herself for stones she'd already been hit with before. Mildred Hayes approached near the coffee table in her expensive wool coat trimmed with fur. Well, she said sweetly. Cedar Creek certainly enjoys surprises these days. Silas gave a short nod. Mildred's eyes drifted toward Clara's worn gloves. Some stains never wash off, she said lightly. No matter how respectable folks try to make them appear. Silence spread fast across the room. Owen looked down at the floor. Clara's face didn't change at all. That somehow made it worse. Silas felt something sharp and final settle inside him then. Enough. He stepped forward before Clara could quietly endure another second of it. Then maybe this town ought to learn the difference between scandal and courage. Every eye turned toward him. Mildred blinked. Silas kept going. This woman rode into a Montana blizzard, alone with nothing but the truth to her name. She saved my boy while most people here were sitting warm beside their fires repeating gossip. No one moved. She never lied, he said, never begged, never asked for pity. And the poorest person in this room carries more dignity than half the town put together. The church hall stayed completely still. Then old Mr. Donnelly from the blacksmith shop removed his hat slowly. Well, he muttered gruffly, sounds to me like the lady deserves better than whispers. His wife stepped beside Clara almost immediately. You come sit with us next Sunday, dear. One by one, the tension broke apart. Reverend Pike shook Clara's hand warmly. Mrs. Harper offered extra fabric from her store for new winter dresses. Even a few ranch wives who'd repeated the gossip lowered their eyes in shame. Mildred Hayes stood rigid near the coffee urn before finally turning away without another word. Outside, sunlight flashed across melting snowbanks while churchgoers drifted slowly into the street. Clara stood beside the wagon quietly, gloved hands folded together. You didn't have to do that, she said softly. Yes, Silas answered. I did. Their eyes met fully then, no walls, no distance. Just truth standing between them in cold winter sunlight. The ride home felt different, lighter somehow. Halfway back to Red Hollow Ranch, Owen fell asleep against Clara's shoulder beneath the quilts. Silas glanced toward them, more than once while guiding the horses through the narrow mountain road. When the ranch finally appeared ahead, afternoon light stretched gold across the snow-covered valley. Owen woke suddenly and pointed toward the fence near the porch. Look, tiny purple crocus flowers pushed through melting snow beside the gateposts. Small, fragile, alive anyway. Clara stared at them silently. I planted those with Sarah, Silas said quietly. First spring we lived here. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Silas reached into his coat pocket. The small ring box felt warm from resting close against him all day. Clara looked startled when he held it out. Inside rested a simple gold band worn smooth with years. My mother's, he said. Her breath caught softly. Silas looked toward the house before speaking again. I don't want you staying because you got nowhere else to go. The wind moved gently through the valley now. No storm left in it. He looked back at her. I want you staying because this is your home. Clara's composure finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just tears slipping quietly down her face while she pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. No one had chosen her before, not truly. Silas stepped closer slowly, giving her every chance to step away. She didn't. Owen grinned so wide it nearly split his face apart. Does this mean she stays forever? Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him through tears and winter sunlight. Yes, she whispered. Owen whooped loud enough to scare birds from the fence posts. By sunset, the cabin windows glowed warm gold against the snow. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney. Inside, Clara folded clean laundry beside the fire, while Owen chased the dog through the kitchen, laughing hard enough to shake the walls. Near the window sat Sarah's repaired wool scarf. Beside it rested the small wooden flower Silas had carved quietly late the night before. Old grief, new love, neither replacing the other. Outside, snow continued melting slowly beneath the coming spring. And inside Red Hollow Ranch, the lonely silence that once haunted every room was finally gone for good. Maybe that's the part that stays with you after the story ends. Not the storm, not the gossip, not even the moment Silas placed that old ring into Clara's trembling hands. Maybe it's the quieter thing. A tired man standing in a doorway, realizing warmth had returned to his home one small act at a time. A woman who arrived with almost nothing, discovering that being chosen means more than being rescued. A little boy falling asleep without fear for the first time in years. And if you've ever sat in a house that felt too quiet after losing someone, if you've ever wondered whether your heart could survive another goodbye, then maybe you understand why Silas fought so hard to hold on to what he nearly pushed away. Some people walk into our lives carrying money, others carry comfort. But every now and then, someone arrives carrying peace. Those are the people worth opening the door for. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're listening from, and whether you believe a person can truly find home again after loss. And if you'd like, stay a little longer here with us. There are more stories waiting down these snowy roads ahead. Stories about second chances, forgotten places, wounded hearts, and the quiet kind of love that changes a life slowly, one winter evening at a time.